My name is Emily Carter, and I was 29 when my world fell apart. My mother, Linda, had been my anchor, my compass, my safe place in a world that often felt cold and chaotic. Losing her was like losing a part of myself, a part one had never been ready to live without. The funeral had been scheduled for a gray Thursday morning in early October. The sky was heavy with clouds, and a light drizzle coated the streets of our small town in Ohio. I remember thinking how perfectly the weather mirrored my inner turmoil, as if nature itself mourned alongside me. I had woken up that morning feeling hollow, my body numb, yet my mind racing with memories of my mother. I pulled on the black dress Mom had once praised, the one I always thought made me look poised and elegant. My hair was pulled into a loose bun, a few strands escaping to frame my tear-streaked face. I didn't want to look perfect. I wanted to look present. I wanted to honor her, even if I felt incapable of holding myself together. Driving to the funeral home with my younger brother, Nathan, was surreal. The streets felt eerily quiet, as if the town itself held its breath. The familiar sights, the corner bakery where Mom bought her morning bagels, the park where we had spent countless afternoons, all seemed coated in a layer of melancholy that made my chest tighten. Nathan kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tense, hands gripping the steering wheel like it could somehow anchor him to reality. We didn't speak much. Words felt inadequate, meaningless even. When we arrived, the funeral home was bustling with family, friends, and neighbors, all dressed in muted tones, their faces etched with grief and sympathy. Hugs were exchanged, hands squeezed, condolences murmured. And then I noticed the empty space where my father should have been. Mark Carter, my dad, the man who had promised to be a pillar in my life, was absent. My stomach knotted. Initially, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe traffic, maybe a delayed flight. But deep down, a cold suspicion gnawed at me. The ceremony began with soft piano music, the kind Mom loved, followed by the minister's voice, steady and comforting. I forced myself to focus, to absorb the words about love, life, and legacy. But my attention kept drifting to that empty chair, a silent reminder that my father had chosen absence over presence in the most pivotal moment of my life. As the service continued, friends shared stories of Mom's generosity, humor, and warmth. I smiled faintly, memories of her laugh, her soft hands, and the way she always made our family dinners feel sacred filling my mind. After the service, as guests lingered for a small reception, I noticed my phone buzzing incessantly. It was Nathan, looking pale and anxious. "Emily, you need to see this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. He handed me his phone, and there it was, a photo of my dad, smiling, arms around a woman I didn't know, apparently taken that very morning in a city several states away. The caption confirmed what I had feared. He was traveling with his mistress, completely ignoring the funeral, ignoring Mom, ignoring me. I felt a surge of emotions so intense they nearly knocked me off my feet. Betrayal, anger, heartbreak, disbelief, each one a jagged blade slicing through the numbness I had been clinging to. I sank into a nearby chair, my hands shaking as I scrolled through the messages confirming the truth. It was surreal. How could someone who had vowed to love and protect us act with such callousness? How could he erase decades of family history with a single choice? Nathan sat beside me, his own face pale, eyes glistening. I don't get it," he whispered. How could he? We didn't need to speak further. The silence between us said everything. We were both grappling with a new reality, that the man who had been our father was not the man we thought we knew. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I moved through the motions of greeting relatives, offering thanks for their support, nodding politely, and smiling when necessary. Inside, though, my mind was a storm. Every memory of Dad, teaching me to ride a bike, helping Nathan with his homework, the countless dinners he had promised he'd make but occasionally skipped, was now tainted by this act of betrayal. The trust one had placed in him, the love I had assumed was unconditional, felt like a lie. By evening, the reception had ended, and most guests had left. Nathan and I returned to our childhood home, the place now saturated with Mom's absence. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and refuses to let go. I wandered through the rooms, touching objects she had loved, her favorite armchair, the framed photos on the wall, the little vase she always kept on the kitchen counter. Tears fell freely as I sank onto the couch, finally allowing the weight of grief, anger, and betrayal to wash over me. I thought back to the times I had defended Dad when friends or relatives had questioned his behavior, the small lies he had told to maintain appearances, the subtle ways he had put his desires above our family. None of it compared to this moment, though. This was an open, undeniable act of betrayal, a final confirmation that the man I had called Dad was capable of immense selfishness and cruelty. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake in the room that had once been my sanctuary, listening to the hum of the city outside, the sounds of life continuing as if Mom's death and Dad's betrayal were inconsequential. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the familiar ache in my chest, the one that had started with Mom's illness and now intensified with the revelation of my father's actions. My mind kept returning to the photo, to the image of him grinning with someone else while we mourned the woman who had given him everything. Somewhere in the night, I realized something crucial. My grief for Mom was mine alone, and my anger toward Dad, as deep and consuming as it was, didn't have to define me. I could acknowledge his betrayal, feel the hurt fully, and yet choose how I would respond. I could honor Mom by living fully, by embracing the values she had instilled in Nathan and me, by refusing to let Dad's selfishness dictate my happiness. Morning came, pale and soft, and I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity. The previous day had been a whirlwind of emotions, but now, in the quiet morning light, I resolved to face my father, not with confrontation or vengeance, at least not yet, but with honesty and truth. I needed to understand, I needed to speak, and I needed to reclaim some sense of agency in a situation that had rendered me powerless. I called him, my hands trembling slightly as I held the phone. When he finally answered, his voice casual, oblivious to the storm inside me, I felt the last shreds of my illusions about him crumble. I spoke, not in accusations but in questions, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. "How could you do this?" I asked. "How could you leave Mama, leave us for her?" The silence on the other end was deafening, punctuated only by the faint sound of his breath. That conversation, brief and unsatisfying, was the first step toward something I couldn't yet name. It wasn't closure, it wasn't revenge, it was simply acknowledgement, a recognition of truth that had been hidden beneath layers of denial and hope for far too long. And as I hung up, I realized that even though my father had shattered my expectations and trust, I still had choices. I still had a path forward. That day marked the beginning of a journey I hadn't planned, a journey through grief, betrayal, and self-discovery. It was painful, it was raw, and at times it felt impossible, but it was mine. And for the first time since Mom's passing, I felt a flicker of strength, a spark of resilience that told me I would survive this, and eventually, I would find a way to honor her memory while navigating the new reality of my fractured family. The morning after the funeral, I woke up in the quiet house my mother had filled with life, now eerily empty. The air smelled faintly of lavender, Mom's favorite scent, and for a moment, I almost imagined she was still here, humming in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with that soft, comforting presence only she could carry. But the illusion shattered as soon as I opened my eyes fully. Mom was gone. And my father, he had chosen absence, not only during her last moments, but in her final farewell. Nathan had stayed at the house overnight, insisting he needed the comfort of someone else, someone who also carried the grief in their chest. We sat together on the couch in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but heavy, filled with words left unsaid and feelings too raw to speak. He finally broke it, his voice hoarse. "Emily, I looked at that photo again. I can't get it out of my head. Dad, he really was with her while Mom's funeral was happening." I swallowed hard, nodding, though no one was there to see it. The betrayal wasn't just mine. It was shared, a wound that cut through both of us in different, equally painful ways. We had always believed Dad loved Mom. We had believed in the image of our family, the warmth, the laughter, the vacations, the birthday traditions. All of it now felt like a carefully staged illusion, a fragile house of cards that collapsed under the weight of truth. I tried to distract myself that day, moving through the house methodically. I pulled down boxes from the attic, things Mom had collected over decades, photos, letters, journals, even clothes she had meticulously folded. Each item was a reminder of her presence, her love, and the void that now defined our lives. I opened a small box of letters, many addressed to Dad. Reading them, I felt her voice, her patience, and her unwavering hope. It was crushing, knowing she had written those words, poured her heart into them, and he had ignored, or perhaps discarded, them. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I needed air, I needed movement. I found myself walking through our neighborhood, the streets dappled with sunlight breaking through clouds. The familiar sights, the corner coffee shop, the park where Mom had taught me to ride my bike, the library steps where Nathan and I had often sat studying. All felt different. Everything seemed smaller somehow, quieter, as if the world itself had been muted in respect for the grief we carried. I passed by the park and sat on a bench, letting my thoughts drift. I thought about the phone conversation I had had with Dad the night before. His voice had been casual, indifferent. There had been no apology, no acknowledgement of the depth of pain he had caused. That call had left me trembling, my anger simmering beneath the surface, but also a strange sense of clarity forming. I realized something I hadn't admitted to myself before. I didn't need him to fix this. His absence had forced me to confront my own strength. As I sat there, I pulled out my journal, the one Mom had encouraged me to keep for years. Writing had always been my refuge, a way to untangle the knots in my mind and heart. I began scribbling furiously, spilling the rawness of my emotions onto the paper: anger, grief, disappointment, confusion. Each word was a small release, a tiny step toward reclaiming control over my own life. Later, Nathan joined me in the park. He sat beside me quietly, not speaking at first, but simply offering his presence. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive him," he finally said, voice trembling. I didn't respond immediately, letting the words hang in the air. Forgiveness wasn't something I could summon on command. It was a process, one I wasn't ready to consider yet. Instead, I nodded, acknowledging the shared pain, letting him know we were in this together. Over the next few days, I immersed myself in Mom's belongings, organizing, sorting, and cataloging them. Each task was both painful and healing. I found her old recipe book, her meticulously arranged photos from family vacations, letters from friends praising her warmth and kindness. I cried often, laughed sometimes, and through it all, I began to feel a subtle shift inside me. The grief was still heavy, but there was also a flicker of resolve forming in the depths of my chest. I realized that while my father's betrayal could shatter illusions, it couldn't take away the lessons, the love, and the strength my mother had instilled in me. One afternoon, as I was sorting through Mom's journals, I stumbled upon a note she had written to me years ago. It was simple, just a few lines, but it carried the weight of her wisdom. "Emily, life will not always be fair, and people may disappoint you. But your heart, your choices, and your love for yourself will always be yours. Stand strong." Reading those words, tears blurred my vision, but for the first time in days, I felt a strange comfort. Mom's guidance, her love, and her faith in me were still alive. I could feel her presence urging me forward, even in her absence. That evening, I decided to face the world outside my grief. I went to my favorite coffee shop, the one Mom and I had often visited on lazy weekends. Sitting at a corner table, I watched the bustle of life continue. People laughing, talking, working, living. I felt a pang of envy and sadness, but also a recognition that life, though painful, continued regardless of our losses. I ordered a coffee, my hands wrapped around the warm cup, drawing strength from the simple act of existing in the world. It was there, In that quiet moment amid strangers, that I realized something profound. My father's actions did not define me. His choices, selfish and cruel as they were his own. I could mourn him, resent him, even fear the ways in which his betrayal might ripple through our lives, but ultimately, my life, my grief, and my healing were mine alone to navigate. Nathan called me later that evening, asking if I wanted to come home. I hesitated, feeling the weight of the day, but agreed. At home, we talked long into the night about Mom, about Dad, about everything we had held back. We laughed at the memories of her quirks. We cried over the moments we would never get back, and through it all, I felt a sense of connection, a bond strengthened not by absence or betrayal, but by shared grief and love. I began to think about what Mom had always encouraged, living fully, embracing challenges, and never allowing bitterness to dominate one's heart. Dad's betrayal had been a cruel blow, but it had also forced me to confront who I was, what I valued, and how I could honor Mom's memory without being paralyzed by anger or sorrow. In the days that followed, I started small. I revisited old hobbies I had abandoned, called friends I had lost touch with, and reconnected with parts of myself that had been overshadowed by family obligations and grief. Each small action was a defiance against despair, a declaration that I would not let betrayal or death define the rest of my life. One night, as I sat by the window, writing in my journal, I realized that healing was not a linear process. Some days, the grief would hit with the force of a tidal wave. Other days, it would be a quiet ache in the background. But each day, each choice to engage with life, was a step forward. I could acknowledge the pain, the betrayal, and the absence of my father, and still find ways to live fully, meaningfully, and with love. That night, I made a silent promise to myself. I would honor Mom by living, by loving, by refusing to let anger and betrayal dictate the terms of my existence. I would allow grief to coexist with joy, sorrow with hope, and betrayal with resilience. My father's actions were a chapter in my story, but they were not the conclusion. The story was mine to write, and for the first time since her passing, I felt a tentative but powerful sense of authorship over my own life. The days after the funeral blurred into one another, a strange mix of sorrow, anger, and quiet reflection. I had begun returning to some semblance of routine, making breakfast, checking emails, running errands, but the shadow of Mom's absence and Dad's betrayal hovered over everything. Each mundane task reminded me of the life that used to be full and predictable, a life that now felt fractured and uncertain. I found myself drawn to my mother's journal one evening. Sitting cross-legged on the floor of my bedroom, I opened it to a random page, the familiar scent of her perfume lingering faintly on the pages. I read her words slowly, savoring the cadence of her thoughts, the humor she had tucked between lines of everyday observations. She had written about ordinary things, her love for gardening, the joy of baking cookies for Nathan and me, her pride in small achievements. Yet beneath it all, there was a strength that resonated deeply. Reading her voice, I felt both sorrow and inspiration. Mom had lived fully, embraced life's ups and downs, and loved without reservation. Could I do the same, even after such betrayal? One particular entry caught my eye. Emily, remember that life will test your heart in ways you cannot imagine. But you have the resilience to rise, to love again, and to find light even in darkness. Never let another's choices define your worth. My hands trembled as I traced the words with my fingers. My mother had understood long before I did that life was unpredictable, that people could disappoint, and that strength wasn't about controlling others. It was about holding yourself together when everything else falls apart. I decided to start small, with things I could control. I called my closest friends, people who had always been my anchor alongside Mom. I shared stories of her, laughter peppering the sorrow, and allowed myself to cry without shame. Their voices reminded me that while Dad's actions had caused pain, I was not alone. I was surrounded by love that was steady, reliable, and healing. Each conversation was a salve, a small patchwork piece mending the raw edges of my heart. Nathan and I took long walks around the neighborhood. Autumn had arrived in full force, leaves a fiery mosaic of orange, red, and gold. There was a bitter chill in the air, but the crispness seemed invigorating, cleansing in a way. Nathan would talk quietly about his memories of Mom, and I would listen, offering anecdotes and laughter in between tears. The shared mourning drew us closer, a bond forged not just by grief, but by mutual understanding and the stark reality of Dad's betrayal. At work, I tried to focus, though every task was tinged with the distraction of my personal life. I was a project manager at a mid-sized tech company in Columbus, Ohio, a role that required organization, communication, and leadership, skills I had honed over years of dedication. Yet, my mind often wandered, replaying the image of Dad with his mistress, juxtaposed against the quiet dignity of Mom's funeral. I realized that this pain, though acute, had given me a new lens through which to view the world. I noticed subtleties in people, I felt empathy more intensely, and I recognized resilience in myself that I hadn't fully acknowledged before. One evening, I walked into a small bookstore near my apartment. The scent of paper and coffee mingled in the air, a comforting aroma that felt like safety. I wandered through the aisles until I found a quiet corner with soft lighting. Pulling out a notebook, I began to write again, not just about grief or betrayal, but about what I wanted for my future. I wrote about my career, the travels I had always dreamed of, and the friendships I wanted to nurture. I wrote about love, the kind that healed rather than hurt, and the strength I hoped to cultivate within myself. Writing became a ritual, a bridge between despair and hope. Sleep was elusive, but the nights offered quiet reflection. I would lie awake, listening to the hum of the city outside my window, replaying memories of Mom, her laughter, the way she tucked Nathan and me in at night, the smell of her perfume lingering after she had hugged us goodbye. The grief was heavy, but with each passing night, it became a weight I could manage rather than one that crushed me entirely. I learned that mourning wasn't about forgetting or moving on quickly. It was about integrating loss into life, carrying it gently without letting it dictate every action. One Saturday, Nathan suggested we visit Mom's favorite park, the place where she had spent countless afternoons gardening, reading, and simply enjoying the serenity of nature. We walked slowly along the familiar trails, the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot, the crisp air tinged with the scent of earth and grass. As we reached the center of the park, a small pond reflected the autumn sky. I sat on a bench, letting the sun warm my face, and allowed myself to speak aloud to Mom. "I miss you, Mom," I said softly, tears slipping down my cheeks. "I don't understand why he would do this, but I'm trying. I'm trying to live in a way that makes you proud." Nathan stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. We didn't need more words. The silence itself was a form of understanding, a shared acknowledgement of love, loss, and resilience. As the week progressed, I began reaching out to distant relatives and friends who had known Mom intimately. Each conversation brought new stories, new perspectives, and new ways to remember her beyond the grief. She had been more than a mother. She had been a friend, a mentor, and a force of positivity. Sharing these memories allowed me to reclaim her essence in my life, to keep it alive despite the absence created by death and betrayal. In quiet moments, my anger toward Dad simmered beneath the surface. It was impossible to ignore the hurt he had caused, the betrayal he had enacted so publicly and so callously. But rather than letting that anger dominate me, I allowed it to become a teacher. It showed me the depth of my own emotional capacity, the importance of boundaries, and the necessity of choosing carefully who we allow to occupy influence in our lives. I realized that his choices were a reflection of his character, not mine, and that distinction was crucial to my healing. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat at my desk reviewing my mother's old photographs. Each picture told a story: birthdays, holidays, family vacations, moments of joy frozen in time. I lingered on a photograph of Mom laughing, eyes crinkled with delight, holding a pie she had baked for Nathan's 10th birthday. I traced the edges with my fingers, letting the memory envelop me. It was bittersweet, the sorrow of her absence, yes, but also the warmth of remembering her life fully, vividly and lovingly. I began to realize that my journey wasn't about seeking revenge, confrontation, or retribution. It was about cultivating resilience, embracing the lessons my mother had imparted, and reclaiming the power of my own life. I could acknowledge the pain inflicted by my father, feel the depth of betrayal, and still choose to live authentically and fully. That choice became my quiet rebellion, my way of honoring Mom without being consumed by anger or bitterness. By the end of part 3, I found myself standing on the threshold of a new chapter. The grief was still present, and Dad's betrayal was an indelible mark on my history, but I felt a spark of hope that had been absent since Mom's passing. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that healing was a process, nonlinear, messy, and deeply personal. Each day offered an opportunity to reclaim joy, to nurture love, and to honor the memory of someone whose life had shaped mine profoundly. Weeks passed, and life began to take on a rhythm, albeit one colored by loss and lingering anger toward my father. I found myself waking earlier each morning, not because I wanted to, but because the weight of grief demanded motion, demanded engagement with the world outside my sorrow-filled mind. The apartment felt emptier now that Nathan had returned to his own place, though he called often, checking in, sharing little updates, asking questions, and reminding me that I wasn't alone. I began spending more time outside, seeking comfort in routines I had abandoned during Mom's illness. The nearby farmer's market became a small sanctuary. The vibrant colors of fresh produce, the chatter of vendors, and the smell of baked bread reminded me that life persisted, vibrant and messy, regardless of personal heartbreak. I wandered through the stalls, lingering on pumpkins and apples, thinking about the holidays to come and how different they would feel without Mom's meticulous preparations and warmth. The thought brought a familiar ache, but it also reminded me that I had choices about how I would live, honor her memory, and navigate the absence left to her wake. One afternoon, I met with a therapist I had been seeing sporadically before Mom fell ill but hadn't fully relied on. Her office was quiet, filled with soft light filtering through sheer curtains, the scent of essential oils calming my frayed nerves. I spoke for hours, recounting not only the grief, but the sting of betrayal I had felt when learning of Dad's actions. I confessed my anger, my helplessness, and my moments of bitterness. Tears fell freely, each one a release, a tiny unburdening of the weight I had been carrying. She listened without judgment, providing guidance and reflections that helped me see that healing wasn't about forgetting but about understanding my emotions and learning to navigate them consciously. That same week, I took a deliberate step I hadn't considered before. I called my father. Not to yell, not to demand explanations, but simply to engage with the reality of our relationship. I asked questions, listened to his answers, and realized the painful truth. He was incapable of the empathy I craved. His choices were his own, reflective of his priorities, his desires, and his flaws. Recognizing this didn't erase my hurt, but it gave me a sense of power, the power to release expectations and stop allowing his actions to dictate my emotional state. Work became a different kind of refuge. I channeled the energy I had previously spent on frustration into projects and leadership, finding solace in tangible results and clear goals. My colleagues noticed a change in me, a quiet confidence, a focus sharpened by adversity. Where I had once allowed life to sweep me along passively, I now felt a subtle but undeniable sense of agency. I made decisions without hesitation, trusted my instincts, and even began mentoring a new hire, someone young and eager, reminding me of the guidance Mom had always offered me. Social life gradually returned, though cautiously. I met friends for coffee, dinner, and walks in the park. Conversation flowed easier than it had in months, and I began to laugh again, small, tentative laughs that reminded me I was still capable of joy. Each moment of connection reinforced the lesson I had been learning. Grief, betrayal, and loss were parts of life, but they did not define the entirety of my existence. There was still space for love, for friendship, for moments of unadulterated happiness. One particularly vivid evening, I found myself at Mom's favorite overlook, a cliffside that offered sweeping views of the Ohio Valley. The sky was painted with the deep oranges and pinks of sunset, the air crisp and fragrant with the early signs of autumn. I stood there alone, hands resting on the railing, the wind tugging at my hair. I spoke aloud, almost as if she were there, listening. "Mom, I miss you. Every day I miss you. But I'm learning, I'm trying. I want to live in a way that would make you proud." The words felt weighty, but liberating. Saying them aloud allowed me to claim my grief, while simultaneously releasing the paralyzing fear and anger that had gripped me. As autumn deepened, I began experimenting with creative outlets. Mom had always encouraged artistic expression, from painting to baking to photography. I picked up a camera, capturing images of falling leaves, children playing in the park, and sunbeams filtering through autumn trees. The act of framing the world through my lens became both therapeutic and grounding. Each photograph told a story of life moving forward, of beauty persisting despite pain, of resilience quietly taking root. I also started volunteering at a local shelter, a small but meaningful way to honor Mom's compassionate spirit. I met people from all walks of life, some grieving, some struggling, some finding their way through hardship, and in helping them, I discovered a renewed sense of purpose. The work was challenging, emotional, and at times exhausting, but it reminded me that healing wasn't just about personal recovery. It was about extending empathy, kindness, and support to others. Conversations with Nathan became more reflective and profound. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace in our childhood living room, he said softly, "Emily, I've noticed something. You're different now. Stronger. Not bitter, not angry all the time. You've grown." I paused, considering his words. There was truth in them, though the growth had been hard-earned, carved from nights of tears, introspection, and moments of quiet courage. I nodded, a small, appreciative smile crossing my face. I think I'm starting to understand what Mom meant when she said strength isn't about never feeling pain. It's about learning to live with it. Even Dad occasionally reached out, his messages tentative, often filled with apologies or explanations I didn't fully want to hear. I read them, sometimes responded, but mostly I let them sit. I realized that closure wouldn't come from him. It would come from me. My healing depended not on his recognition of wrongdoing, not on his remorse, but on my ability to navigate my own emotions, reclaim my sense of self, and create a life that honored Mom and my own resilience. By late October, the air had grown colder, the trees mostly bare, and the rhythm of daily life had begun to feel familiar again. I had created new routines, morning runs in the park, journaling each evening, volunteering on weekends, staying connected with friends and colleagues. The world hadn't changed, the grief hadn't disappeared, but I had found a way to live within it, to move forward without denying its presence, and to let it shape me into someone wiser, more empathetic, and stronger than I had ever imagined. And through it all, a quiet realization emerged. Betrayal, loss, and grief were part of the human experience, but they were not the sum total of it. Life still held joy, beauty, connection, and love. I had the power to embrace those elements fully, without letting the absence of my mother or the failures of my father define me. In that acceptance, I found a fragile but undeniable peace, a peace that signaled not an end to grief, but a mastery over its influence, a reclaiming of personal power. Part 4 ended with me standing at that overlook once again, watching the sun dip below the horizon, feeling the chill of autumn on my skin. I breathed deeply, savoring the wind, the colors, the world continuing around me. I was still grieving, yes, and my father's betrayal still stung sharply, but I had discovered something profound, the ability to feel pain fully and still choose life, joy, and love. That realization was not just comforting, it was empowering, a lesson Mom had hoped I would carry with me forever. By mid-November, the world outside mirrored the internal changes I was experiencing. Leaves had mostly fallen, leaving skeletal branches etched against gray skies, yet there was a certain clarity in the starkness, a reminder that even when life appears bare, growth remains beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment. I felt that same undercurrent in myself, a quiet, persistent energy that had slowly replaced the numbness and anguish of the weeks following Mom's passing. Each morning, I began to wake earlier, not out of obligation, but out of a deliberate desire to reclaim time and establish control over my own life. I brewed coffee in the quiet kitchen, its warmth grounding me, and began jotting down a simple routine on a sheet of paper, a list of small but meaningful actions that could help me feel alive and engaged. A morning walk, a journaling session, calls to friends, work tasks, and time set aside for introspection. It was a structure that didn't erase my grief, but provided a framework within which I could navigate it. I spent more time revisiting my mother's influence, reflecting on her lessons not just as memories, but as guiding principles. She had always championed authenticity, resilience, and compassion, often reminding me that our choices mattered far more than the actions of others. The contrast between her life and my father's behavior became a lens through which I evaluated not only my own decisions, but the people I allowed close to me. There was no room for those whose presence was toxic or disloyal. That understanding, though bitter, gave me clarity and a growing sense of personal sovereignty. Work offered both distraction and satisfaction. I channeled my focus into a major project that had been lingering for months, one that required meticulous attention to detail, leadership skills, and consistent communication with our team. The tasks themselves were challenging, but the act of dedicating energy to something tangible, something productive, was deeply restorative. Each milestone we achieved felt like a personal victory, a quiet assertion that despite the upheaval in my private life, I could maintain competence, creativity, and resilience. Social interactions became a lifeline. I sought out friends and colleagues, not out of obligation, but to share experiences, laughter, and perspectives that reminded me of life's broader canvas. One evening, I attended a small dinner with old friends, a casual gathering filled with conversation, warmth, and an absence of judgment. For the first time in weeks, I laughed fully, unguardedly. That night, I felt a subtle but profound shift. Life had not stopped, and despite my pain, I could still participate in its beauty and complexity. Nathan continued to be a source of support. He visited more frequently, sometimes to share a quiet meal, sometimes simply to sit in companionable silence. Our conversations evolved from grieving our mother to exploring our own aspirations, reflecting on our strengths, and discussing ways to honor Mom's memory through our actions. His presence reminded me that connection, empathy, and shared understanding could coexist with grief, that love, even in its quietest forms, persisted. One weekend, I made a decision to revisit Mom's garden. Overgrown and untended, it had been a reflection of the months of illness and grief. Armed with gloves, pruning shears, and determination, I began the meticulous process of restoration. As I pulled weeds, trimmed overgrown bushes, and replanted flowers, I felt a deep connection to my mother's spirit. The act of nurturing life in her garden was symbolic, a tangible way to honor her, to reclaim beauty in the midst of loss, and to remind myself that growth is possible even after seasons of neglect and hardship. While my healing was progressing, the shadow of my father lingered. Occasionally, his name would cross my mind, a pang of anger surfacing. But each time it did, I noticed something remarkable. The intensity of my reaction had lessened. I could acknowledge the betrayal without being consumed by it. I realized that he would never be the person I needed him to be, and trying to force reconciliation or seeking justice through confrontation was neither productive nor necessary. My focus had shifted to what I could control: my emotions, my actions, and my capacity for resilience. One late afternoon, I revisited a cafe Mom had loved. Sitting by the window, I sipped tea and watched the world move outside. People hurrying along sidewalks, dogs tugging at leashes, couples chatting, laughter drifting on the wind. I pulled out a notebook and began writing a letter, not to my father, not even to Mom, but to myself. I poured onto the pages everything I had felt over the past months: grief, anger, confusion, longing, and also the lessons I had learned, the ways I had grown, and the hope I still held for the future. The act of writing was cathartic, a method of cementing my progress and acknowledging the distance I had traveled emotionally. That evening, Nathan called with a spontaneous idea. Why don't we organize a small memorial gathering for Mom? Not a funeral, not a somber event, but a celebration of her life, the way she would have wanted it. The suggestion resonated deeply. It was not about confronting our grief, but about embracing the joy and love she had spread throughout her life. Together, we planned an intimate gathering with close family and friends, complete with stories, laughter, and moments of reflection. The idea filled me with both anticipation and nervousness, but I knew it would be a turning point in my journey of healing. In preparing for the memorial, I immersed myself in planning every detail: the flowers, the music, the stories we would share. I wanted it to reflect Mom's warmth and spirit, a tangible manifestation of her legacy. As I coordinated with friends and family, I noticed my perspective shifting. The act of celebrating her life, rather than merely mourning her absence, allowed me to experience grief differently, as a mixture of sorrow and gratitude, loss and appreciation, pain and resilience. The night of the memorial arrived. The space we chose was intimate, decorated with photographs of Mom, candles, and freshly arranged flowers. Friends and relatives shared stories, moments of humor, kindness, and lessons she had imparted. I listened, laughed, and cried, feeling the presence of her spirit in every word. Nathan stood beside me, a reassuring presence, and I realized that our grief, while profound, had not prevented us from honoring life, love, and connection. At one point during the evening, I stepped outside to the quiet of the garden, the cool November air brushing against my skin. I gazed at the stars, feeling both small and vast, the enormity of the universe contrasting with the intimate space of my grief. I spoke aloud, almost in a whisper. Mom, I hope I'm making you proud. I'm learning to live, to love, and to find light again. I'm okay. I'm finding my way. The words carried weight, yet they also carried freedom, the freedom to embrace life fully, to honor her memory, and to acknowledge my own resilience without bitterness. By the time the gathering concluded, I felt a subtle but undeniable sense of closure. Not closure in the sense of forgetting, nor in absolving my father's actions, but in reclaiming the narrative of my life. I had navigated the depth of grief, faced betrayal, and emerged with insight, strength, and a renewed capacity for love and joy. The memorial was not an ending but a milestone, a marker of progress and growth, a moment to pause and acknowledge how far I had come. As I walked home that night, the cool air tingling on my cheeks, I felt an inner calm I hadn't experienced since Mom's passing. My journey was ongoing, and the scars of betrayal and loss would always be part of me. But I had discovered the ability to exist fully, to feel deeply, and to act intentionally. I understood that life's unpredictability, its capacity for pain and disappointment, could not rob me of the power to choose, to heal, and to cultivate joy. As November faded into December, a strange calm had settled over me, the kind that comes after the storm but carries with it an awareness that the aftermath requires careful navigation. I woke each morning with a sense of purpose that had been absent for months, a quiet determination to live intentionally rather than reactively. The grief for Mom remained, but it no longer dominated every thought or dictated every action. It had become a companion, a weight I carried with dignity rather than despair. The first snow fell quietly one evening, dusting the streets of Columbus in pristine white. I bundled myself in a gray wool coat, a scarf snug around my neck, and gloves that had belonged to Mom. I stepped outside to walk, the cold air crisp and refreshing, the crunch of snow beneath my boots grounding me. Each breath seemed to carry away remnants of lingering bitterness, leaving space for reflection, gratitude, and clarity. The city was quieter in winter, the usual bustle muffled by snow, and I found the solitude comforting, a space to breathe, to think, and to simply be. At work, I took on a mentorship role for a junior colleague, a young woman navigating the early stages of her career with ambition and uncertainty. Guiding her through challenges, offering advice, and sharing insights became a form of healing in itself. It reminded me of the value of empathy, the importance of fostering growth in others, and the power of passing along lessons learned through both triumphs and mistakes. Mom's voice echoed in my mind during these moments, her encouragement, her wisdom, and her unwavering belief in my abilities guiding me like a quiet compass. In my personal life, I began to experiment with small adventures, visits to art galleries, short hikes in nearby state parks, and even signing up for a photography workshop. Each experience was a deliberate choice to embrace life, to seek beauty, and to cultivate joy even amidst the ongoing grief. There was a subtle thrill in doing things alone, in being responsible only for my own satisfaction and growth. It was a freedom I had not known before, a sense of self-reliance that was both empowering and liberating. One evening, as I reviewed old family videos, I stumbled upon footage of Mom laughing uncontrollably at a holiday gathering. Her joy was infectious, the warmth in her eyes undeniable. I paused the video, letting her laughter fill the room, and felt a profound connection. The moment reminded me that life was fragile, that joy could coexist with sorrow, and that cherishing these memories was not a betrayal of grief, but an acknowledgement of its depth. I allowed myself to smile, the sensation raw yet healing, a testament to the resilience I had cultivated. Nathan and I had begun to talk more about the future, not in terms of escape or distraction, but in terms of building a life reflective of our values and aspirations. We discussed potential travels, creative projects, and ways to honor Mom's memory through acts of service and connection. These conversations were lighthearted, yet meaningful, a gentle reminder that life could move forward without erasing the past. In planning for the future, I felt a sense of agency that had been absent for far too long, a recognition that while I could not control all outcomes, I could shape my path intentionally. At home, I created a small space dedicated to reflection, journaling, and creative expression. Candles, photographs, and mementos of Mom adorned a corner of my apartment, a sanctuary where I could process emotions, celebrate memories, and plan my next steps. I wrote letters, not necessarily to anyone but to myself, capturing thoughts, fears, dreams, and lessons. The act of writing became meditative, a practice that allowed me to articulate my growth, acknowledge lingering pain, and reinforce the autonomy I had worked so hard to reclaim. The holiday season approached, and while I had initially feared the emotional weight it would carry, I found ways to navigate it with grace. I volunteered at community events, baked cookies, and organized small gatherings for friends who, like me, carried their own invisible burdens. Sharing time, laughter, and care became a balm, reinforcing the understanding that life's challenges did not preclude moments of joy and connection. Mom's spirit, omnipresent in these acts of kindness, became a guiding light, reminding me that even in absence, influence and love endure. One particularly quiet evening, I revisited the overlook where I had spoken to Mom months prior. The sky was clear, the stars reflected in the distant river below. I wrapped my coat tightly around me, breathing in the crisp night air, and allowed myself a long, contemplative moment. "Mom," I whispered, "I'm still learning. I'm still finding my way. But I think I'm becoming the person you always hoped I would be." The words carried both weight and liberation, a quiet acknowledgement of my journey and the distance I had traveled. Even Dad's occasional messages began to feel less intrusive. I read them, sometimes responded, but no longer allowed them to disturb my equilibrium. His choices, his betrayals, and his absence from meaningful parts of my life no longer defined my happiness or self-worth. I had learned to separate his actions from my identity, to assert boundaries, and to protect my emotional landscape. In doing so, I found freedom, the ability to engage with the world on my own terms, and the capacity to cultivate joy independent of past hurt. By mid-December, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not the kind marked by accolades or recognition, but an internal victory over grief, betrayal, and self-doubt. I had navigated the turbulent months with intention, reflection, and courage. I had honored Mom's memory, nurtured relationships that mattered, and cultivated resilience that would serve me long into the future. The wounds of betrayal remained, but they had become part of a broader tapestry of experience, one that included strength, empathy, and a renewed capacity for love. As snow blanketed the city once more, I walked through familiar streets with a sense of quiet confidence. Life, in all its complexity, continued around me. Laughter from neighboring apartments, the distant hum of traffic, the smell of baking bread from local cafes. I was present, engaged, and deeply aware of the choices I could make each day. I had discovered that healing was not a linear journey, that grief could coexist with joy, and that betrayal, while painful, could be reframed as a lesson in personal sovereignty and resilience. I returned home that evening to find Nathan waiting with a cup of tea and a smile. "How was the walk?" he asked. I paused, considering the question, and realized that the walk had not been about distance or exercise. It had been about presence, reflection, and self-affirmation. I smiled, a genuine expression of contentment. "It was necessary," I said softly. Nathan nodded, understanding that some moments of growth were quiet, internal, and immeasurable by words alone. By the end of part 6, I had come to embrace a profound truth. Life does not pause for grief, and betrayal cannot dictate the entirety of one's existence. Healing is an active choice, a daily commitment to self-care, reflection, and intentional engagement with the world. While the scars of loss and betrayal remain, they no longer define me. I had reclaimed my narrative, honoring Mom's legacy and asserting my autonomy in a way that was empowering, deliberate, and deeply transformative. Winter had settled into a quiet rhythm, the streets of Columbus dusted in snow, the air crisp and sharp, yet comforting in its clarity. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of completeness, not in the sense of forgetting, nor in absolving the wrongs committed against me, but in having found my own footing amidst chaos, grief, and betrayal. The journey had been long, winding, and at times unbearably painful, yet it had brought me to a place I could hardly have imagined when Mom passed away, a place of reflection, acceptance, and strength. The holidays approached, carrying with them the weight of absence. Gifts were exchanged, lights twinkled on the streets, and family gatherings buzzed with laughter and anticipation. Yet, I approached this season differently, not with dread or forced cheer, but with conscious intention. I decorated my apartment modestly, placing candles on windowsills, arranging a small evergreen, and setting up a space where memories of Mom could coexist with new traditions I was crafting for myself. I wanted the holidays to honor her spirit without trapping me in despair, a delicate balance I had learned to navigate. One evening, Nathan and I decided to host a small dinner for close friends, a gathering that was warm, intimate, and reflective of the lessons Mom had taught us: connection, generosity, and presence. As people arrived, sharing stories and laughter, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. The room was filled with life, warmth, and love, elements that I had feared would be impossible after my mother's death and the revelation of my father's betrayal. Yet here they were, evidence that even in the aftermath of grief, joy could flourish. I took a moment to step back, observing the scene, friends exchanging jokes, small groups engaged in conversation, and the aroma of roasted vegetables and fresh bread mingling in the air. A memory surfaced, Mom kneeling in the kitchen, laughing as flour dusted her apron while she prepared a meal for the family. The juxtaposition of past and present made my chest ache, yet it was a different ache now. It was not a weight that dragged me down, but a reminder of the richness of life, the depth of relationships, and the resilience of the human spirit. Later that night, after guests had departed and the apartment had settled into silence, I found myself sitting by the window, watching snowflakes drift lazily from the dark sky. I sipped tea, allowing the warmth to seep into my bones, and reflected on the months that had passed. The grief I had carried so heavily in the beginning was still present, but it had transformed, softer, more manageable, and interwoven with strength and acceptance. I realized that healing was not about erasing the past, but about integrating it, allowing it to inform me without controlling me. Nathan joined me, sitting quietly beside me, his presence a steady reassurance. "You've changed, Emily," he said softly. I nodded, contemplating his words. It wasn't a superficial change. It was deep, rooted in introspection, courage, and conscious choice. I had confronted my pain, faced betrayal, and navigated grief, emerging with insight and resilience. I understood now that life would continue to present challenges, yet I had discovered the capacity to engage with them fully, without losing myself to anger, bitterness, or despair. In the following days, I found myself reflecting on my father's absence and betrayal more objectively. The sting remained, but I no longer felt compelled to dwell on it endlessly. His choices were his own, reflective of his character and limitations, and my energy was better spent cultivating my own life, relationships, and ambitions. I could acknowledge the pain he caused without allowing it to dominate my existence. This distinction was liberating, a quiet but profound victory that reinforced my autonomy and emotional strength. I also took the time to deepen my connection with my mother's legacy. I organized her belongings, curated photographs, and created a small digital archive of her writings and memories. Each item, each photograph, told a story of kindness, courage, and joy. Preserving these memories became an act of love and remembrance, a tangible way to honor her impact while continuing to live intentionally in her absence. I felt her presence not as a haunting shadow but as a guiding light, shaping my choices and reminding me of the values I wanted to carry forward. The culmination of my healing, however, came in the quiet moments, the walks through snowy streets, the evenings spent journaling by candlelight, and the conversations with Nathan and friends about dreams, aspirations, and love. I had learned to hold space for grief while embracing life, to acknowledge betrayal without allowing it to define me, and to cultivate strength and joy even in the aftermath of profound loss. It was not an instantaneous transformation but a gradual, deliberate evolution, one that required patience, introspection, and courage. By the time New Year's approached, I felt a renewed sense of possibility. I had started a small photography project documenting the changing seasons, capturing moments of beauty and human connection that reminded me life persisted in all its complexity. I had strengthened relationships with friends, built routines that honored both productivity and reflection, and embraced personal growth in ways I had never imagined. The journey had been arduous, yet it had yielded an understanding of resilience and the power of choice that was more valuable than any fleeting sense of revenge or retribution. On New Year's Eve, Nathan and I watched the fireworks from the overlook where I had spoken to Mom months before. The sky erupted in brilliant colors, each burst mirrored in the distant river below. I held his hand, feeling grounded, present, and fully alive. In that moment, I reflected on the past year. The grief, the betrayal, the moments of despair, and the small triumphs of growth and healing. I realized that while life would continue to test me, I now possessed the tools, insight, and strength to navigate whatever came next with grace and resilience. I whispered to myself, almost in a prayer, "Mom, I miss you every day. I've felt anger, sorrow, and pain, but I'm learning, growing, and living. I promise to honor you through how I choose to live my life." The words felt like a release, a culmination of the months of introspection, and a powerful affirmation of my journey. I had transformed grief into understanding, betrayal into wisdom, and loss into an opportunity for profound self-discovery. As the final fireworks faded, I felt a sense of completion. Not perfection, not the end of pain, but a mastery over my narrative. I had reclaimed my life from grief and betrayal, integrating the past while embracing the present and future with clarity and purpose. The journey had been arduous, but it had also been transformative, revealing the depth of resilience, compassion, and strength that lay within me. That night, as the city settled into quiet, I understood something fundamental. Life is unpredictable, and betrayal can wound deeply, but healing, growth, and joy are choices we can actively pursue. By facing pain head-on, embracing grief without being consumed by it, and cultivating meaningful connections, we reclaim agency over our lives. In doing so, we honor those we have lost, protect ourselves from harm, and discover a capacity for love and resilience that is enduring, empowering, and profoundly liberating. I smiled, feeling the weight of the year behind me and the possibilities ahead. I had navigated grief, confronted betrayal, and emerged not broken, but whole, wiser, stronger, and ready to live a life that reflected the love, values, and courage my mother had instilled in me. The night was cold, the sky clear, and I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. For the first time in months, I knew that while the pain would always be a part of me, it no longer had the power to define me. I had reclaimed my narrative, and in that reclamation, I had found freedom,